Okay, so have you ever seen like a news story come out and
Yeah.
you're just like, wait a second, what is even happening here?
Yeah,
That's kind of how we felt when we started digging into this situation with former President Trump and this law firm called Paul Weiss.
for sure.
We found some really interesting perspectives, and one in particular was from a legal commentary that had a pretty strong take on it.
Yeah, the first thing I noticed looking through the material was the difference in tone between like the straight news report and then this really in-depth legal analysis.
Yeah.
It's definitely thought-provoking.
So, if you're listening to this deep dive, you're probably hoping that we can take this really complex situation and break it down in a way that makes sense without getting too lost in the weeds of, legal jargon.
Right.
So, today we're going to talk about what happened between Trump and Paul Weiss and then what it might mean in the long run.
Exactly.
We're going to be looking closely at this YouTube transcript, which gives a pretty strong opinion about the whole thing.
Yeah. And, our listeners come to these deep dives because they want to get past just like the surface level.
Right.
We're here to help connect the dots and see why this interaction in particular has caused so much debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's lay the groundwork here.
Okay.
The New York Times published this report that went into detail about the situation, and the main point was that former President Trump had it out for Paul Weiss, and actually a few other law firms too, as part of what they called a retribution campaign.
It's pretty crazy to think about the imbalance of power there, right?
Yeah.
Even as a former president, he still has a lot of pull.
Yeah.
And just the idea of using that kind of influence in this way is just like a red flag right away.
It is. And so the report says that this whole back and forth between Trump and Paul Weiss ended up in a standoff.
Okay.
The head of Paul Weiss, a guy named Brad Karp, he and Trump apparently came to some kind of agreement.
Okay.
And the big thing was that Trump would drop an executive order that he had been holding over the firm's head.
Yeah, executive orders, they pack a punch. It's like just the threat of one against a company like a law firm can have huge consequences.
Absolutely. And so to get this executive order off the table, Paul Weiss agreed to a few things.
Okay.
First, they said they would represent clients no matter their political affiliation.
Okay.
Which, I mean, on the surface, that just sounds like what any law firm should do, right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty standard. But the fact that it was like a specific part of the agreement is interesting.
Right.
It makes you wonder if maybe Trump thought they were being picky about who they took on as clients.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
Now, the second part of the deal, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Paul Weiss agreed to give $40 million in legal services to causes that Trump supported.
Wow.
Specifically, they mentioned the president's task force for fighting anti-Semitism, and they said there would be other projects, too, that they would agree on later. But the report pointed out that it wasn't clear exactly how that $40 million would be used to help the task force.
So essentially, we've got this huge financial commitment that's tied to a former president's agenda.
Yeah.
It kind of blurs the lines between legal work and political influence.
Right.
It makes you think about, how legal services, which are supposed to be about what the client needs, how those should interact with political goals.
Yeah, absolutely. There were also a couple other conditions in the deal.
Okay.
Paul Weiss also said they would do an audit of their hiring practices to make sure they were merit-based.
Okay.
And they agreed not to use or adopt any DEI policies, so diversity, equity, inclusion.
Oh, wow. So those last 2 points, those are really at the heart of a lot of the cultural and political debates going on right now.
Yeah.
The focus on hiring based on merit
Yep.
and then like explicitly saying no to DEI. That's really a big deal.
Yeah, it is. And the report mentioned that this whole agreement came after Brad Karp, the guy from Paul Weiss, met with Trump face-to-face at the White House.
Oh, wow.
I mean, can you just imagine that conversation?
Yeah.
Like the head of this big law firm felt like he had to go meet with the president.
Right. Even though he's not the president anymore, it shows you how serious the situation was.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing the New York Times piece mentioned was that people in the legal world were freaking out about this deal.
Yeah. What did they say?
A lot of them pointed out that Paul Weiss has a long history of standing up for civil rights.
Right.
And they also said that the executive order Trump was threatening was probably not even legal.
Oh, that's important.
Yeah.
Because it means that Paul Weiss might have had a really strong case if they had fought the executive order in court instead of making this deal.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second major point, which is where we get a very different take on all of this.
Okay.
It comes from a YouTube transcript by this guy, Glenn Kirshner, who used to be a prosecutor. And let me tell you, he does not hold back.
Yeah, he seems like the type to get straight to the point.
Yeah, he starts out by explaining what extortion means legally in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
He says it's basically taking something valuable from someone or making them do something by using threats or force.
Yeah.
And he puts it in even simpler terms. He says it's like getting something you want by threatening someone or forcing them to do it.
Okay.
And then, boom, he connects this definition directly to what happened with Paul Weiss.
Wow.
He says it's like Trump was punishing the firm with this possibly illegal executive order.
Right.
And then Paul Weiss agreed to give $40 million in legal services to things Trump wanted just to make the order go away.
It's really interesting how he takes that legal definition and applies it step by step to the whole situation.
Yeah.
He's basically saying, based on how extortion is defined, this agreement checks all the boxes.
Yeah, and he doesn't mince words. He straight up says it feels a little extortion-y.
Oh, wow.
Then he brings up this really interesting comparison. He mentions another law firm, Perkins Coie.
Oh.
And they were facing a similar executive order, but they decided to go a totally different way. They're fighting it in court.
Oh, wow.
And Kirshner thinks they're going to win.
So you've got these two law firms, and they react in completely opposite ways.
Mm-hmm.
One tries to negotiate and gives in. The other one says, no, we're going to fight this.
Yeah.
It shows you how different powerful institutions can be when someone powerful is putting pressure on them.
Exactly. And Kirshner is not happy about what Paul Weiss did at all. He uses some pretty strong words like buckled, caved, and capitulated.
Mm-hmm.
He even suggests that maybe they were just thinking about their bottom line, their profit margins, which he calls shameful.
So he's basically saying they put money ahead of their principles and the rule of law.
Yeah, and Kirshner also takes issue with how some of the mainstream media was reporting on this whole thing.
Oh, really? How so?
He points out that some news outlets described it as unconventional negotiating by a president.
It's amazing how much the way the media presents things can shape how people understand them.
Yeah, and Kirshner uses this crazy analogy to make his point.
That's okay.
He compares calling this unconventional negotiating to calling murder an unconventional form of population control. I mean, it's a pretty extreme comparison, but it shows how strongly he disagrees with the media's take.
It definitely makes you stop and think.
Yeah.
Is unconventional negotiating really the right way to describe what happened, especially when you consider that the executive order might have been illegal?
Yeah, exactly. And Kirshner is worried that this kind of framing waters down the seriousness of the situation and that it's actually hurting our democracy because no one is standing up to what he calls an aspiring dictator.
He's basically saying that institutions should have pushed back against what he sees as an abuse of power.
Right. And then he makes this really powerful connection to domestic violence cases.
Really?
He explains that when he was a prosecutor, he saw a lot of situations where victims of domestic violence were too scared or just didn't want to stand up to their abuser.
It's a really powerful comparison,
Yeah.
It shifts the focus away from this big, powerful law firm and makes you think about how vulnerable people can be when they're facing threats and coercion.
Exactly. And he says that in domestic violence cases, the police have a duty to step in even if the victim is afraid to take action.
Right.
And he connects this to Paul Weiss by saying that they had the money and the legal standing to fight the executive order.
So he's basically saying that it's important to call out wrongdoings, even if it's hard or risky.
Yeah, and he's questioning whether Paul Weiss kind of shirked their responsibility in this case.
That makes sense.
And then he brings up a major concern about the political climate at the time.
Okay.
He mentions people like Attorney General Pam Bondi and others.
Uh-huh.
And he suggests that under Trump, the Department of Justice and federal prosecutors were probably not going to protect people who were being targeted by the administration, even if those actions were illegal, unless the person or company being targeted fought back themselves.
Oh, wow. So he's saying that there was a lack of support for anyone who wanted to challenge what the administration was doing.
Yeah, and then Kirshner starts talking about motivations and the long-term effects of this whole thing. He wonders if Paul Weiss was just motivated by money, like their profits, or if they were just doing a cold calculation of what would cost them less.
So basically, we're back to the question of ethics.
Right, like what's really driving the decisions of these powerful organizations.
Yeah.
And Kirshner also considers how clients might see law firms that react in different ways to pressure, like some firms negotiate and some fight back.
Right.
He says that a firm like Paul Weiss, which had this reputation for standing up to the government, might have actually hurt their reputation by choosing to make a deal in this case.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Their image as defenders of civil rights might be tarnished now.
Yeah, and Kirshner finishes with this really pointed line. He says, "Justice matters, maybe not friends."
Oh, wow.
It's pretty clear he's not happy with what Paul Weiss did.
Yeah, that last line really sums up his whole message.
Yeah.
He's saying that standing up for justice should come before anything else.
Exactly. So to recap, we've looked at this agreement between Trump and Paul Weiss and the questions about whether it might have been extortion. We've seen how Paul Weiss reacted compared to another law firm that faced a similar situation. And we've heard some serious concerns about what this all means for the rule of law and how healthy our democracy is.
So the news report gave us the facts of the agreement, but the commentary really helps us analyze those facts and see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's what we want to help you, our listeners, do. So what stands out to you the most about this situation?
Yeah, what really makes you stop and think?
Yeah, what parts make you think about the bigger picture here?
It's not just about what happened, it's about why it happened and what it could mean in the future.
Yeah, so here's something to think about. We saw how Paul Weiss and Perkins Coie reacted in different ways. What does this tell us about how powerful institutions respond when someone powerful is putting pressure on them? And what does it mean for the rest of us when these institutions make different choices?
Yeah.
It might be interesting to see how different news outlets have reported on this and really think about those questions.
Yeah, these are questions that keep coming up as we try to understand how our society works.
Yeah.
How do institutions deal with these tough situations, and what are the long-term effects of their decisions? It's something we should all be paying attention to.